Hello and welcome to another edition of YTech. Today we're going to take a look at Intel's 11th gen processors, particularly the 11900K and the 11600K, and see if it is a good buy in this current day and age, especially with all the CPU shortages and all of that. So first things first, I know this review is a little bit late. It's also because I had to go for a surgery, but it gave me a chance to experience the CPUs from a consumer point of view. So stuff that you're going to see today is basically somewhat like the retail version. All the BIOS in the motherboards and stuff like that is what you can find out in the retail market. So there are no like reviewers, BIOS and stuff like that. So things that you are seeing today is what you're going to get. And also to get the pleasantries out of the way, thank you to ASUS for supplying a Z590 motherboard for us to test the CPUs on. And also thank you for loaning us a tough 3080 because we couldn't find one in the market, or especially with this GPU shortage and stuff like that. Also big thanks to Intel for sending out the CPUs for review, and also big thanks to AMD for also allowing us to use the Ryzen CPUs to compare the Intel CPUs to. And also thank you for the 6800 XT so that we can do an apples to apples comparison whether a 3080 will give more performance on certain CPUs or whether the 6800 XT will give more performance on AMD CPUs, or maybe make the Intel CPUs become better. I don't know. So all of those comparisons were done so that you guys know whether it affects any kind of CPU performance or not. But spoiler alert, in this review you are just going to see a 3080 because the 6800 XT actually doesn't give any kind of performance gains to either CPUs. So yeah, whether you are using an AMD or an NVIDIA GPU, it actually doesn't really affect the CPU's performance. And also to get all the technicalities out of the way, for the Ryzen CPUs I use the ASUS X570 Hero, and for the Intel CPUs I use the Z590 Hero. All CPUs were cooled with the Lianli Galahad 360 AIO, and I used 32GB of Crucial Ballistics DDR memory, which is clocked at CL16. So right now I'll just put all the graphs on screen. We tested 5 things. We tested Cinebench R20 and we tested 4 games, which were Fortnite, Call of Duty Warzone, Borderlands 3 and Valorant. And after the graphs, I'll just explain what my thoughts are on the Intel CPUs and maybe a few pros and cons on whether you should buy the CPUs or not. Now we are back to the video. There's something I forgot to mention earlier on. I didn't pit the i9 against the 5900X because I feel that it is quite unfair to put a 12-core CPU against an 8-core CPU. And you heard that right, the i9 this generation is only 8 cores and 16 threads. Very, very similar to the Ryzen 7 5800X. And yeah, it's only fair to pit an 8-core versus an 8-core because the 5900X, from what I've tested and all that stuff, it's just really unfair to have that extra 4 cores and 8 threads. Even when it comes to gaming, the 5800X actually is really similar to the 5900X anyway. So yeah, let's start with the i9 11900K. As you can see from the graphs, it is really not much different from the 5800X. In single-threaded workloads, it performs slightly better than the 5800X. But when it comes to multi-threaded stuff, as you can see in the Cinebench scores, the 5800X still outperforms the i9, not by much, but still outperforms the i9. And when it comes to games, I don't see any kind of significant improvements versus AMD when it comes to like frame rates and stuff. Sure, some games like Borderlands runs better for some reason on Intel CPUs, even though the game is made for AMD. You can see it on the title screen, what AMD logo comes out right big when you start the game. And even in Call of Duty Warzone, there is a slight advantage for Intel, but not by much. And in Fortnite, you can actually see that the 11900K is actually just performing as well as the 5800X. So if you were to ask me about which processor to get, it is actually quite a tough choice. Both of them perform the same. Intel doesn't really have the gaming edge anymore, and it performs basically the same as the 5800 Hex. It really depends on the games that you play. If you are playing Warzone, maybe you want to get an i9. If you're playing Valorant, maybe you want to get the 5800X. But let's talk about recommendations later, because we also need to take into account the price of the motherboards for this CPU and also the price in the market for the Ryzens. It's just a big mess right now. So let's just talk about pure performance first. Now, the real winner I see here is actually the 11600K. This CPU performs exactly on par with the 5600X. And I'm pretty sure you can see a theme here that the current 11th gen processors from Intel pretty much equalizes the playing ground between the Ryzen 5000 series and Intel. I realized I was holding the wrong box anyway, but so yeah, the 5600X is on par with the 1100K. So yeah, the short form of it is that the 5800X and the 11900K are similar, and the 5600X and the 11600K are similar. Now let's get to somewhat of the meat of the video, whether you should get the 11th gen processors or not. So I'll break this down into a pros and cons section. Let's start with the pros first. So for the pros, if you have a Z490 motherboard, you can actually just buy an 11th gen CPU and update your BIOS on the 490 motherboard, and you can just put this in. You don't need to buy any kind of other motherboards and stuff like that, and it still uses the same socket. If you're in the market for a 6-core CPU, the 11600K is actually a really good buy. But then, now I'll get to the cons. You might be wondering why the pros list is so short, because it really is. Now, if you have had a Z490 motherboard, high chance you would already have a 10th gen CPU in it. Actually, not even high chance, it's 100% chance, because no other Intel CPUs can actually use the Z490 motherboard. And if you're asking me whether you should upgrade from the 10600K or the 10900K to the 11th gen CPUs, no. For the 11600K, maybe if you just want to have that extra performance boost, because it is actually slightly more powerful than the 10600K. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 15%. And this includes like workloads and stuff like that. So if you can't live with the 10600K, then I guess the 11600K is a good buy. But then if you already have the 10900K or the 10700K, the 11900K is not really a good buy. It really is a weird CPU. First things first, 10900K has 10 cores and 20 threads. If you buy this, you're losing 2 cores and 4 threads, which means in multi-threaded loads, you are going to lose out. And if you're going to compare like gaming benchmarks and stuff like that, it is not very significantly different. And if you have a 10700K, the 11900K maybe is slightly better for gaming and also maybe multi-threaded workloads. But the price difference between the 10700K and the 11900K is just way too wide to justify that little performance increase from the 11900K. Now let's just talk about motherboard compatibility. If you are using something like a 2nd gen Ryzen or whatsoever, highly likely you do have a B450 motherboard or a X470 motherboard or an X570 or B550 motherboard. If you're interested in buying the 5000 series CPUs, you can just take the CPUs and then you can just update your BIOS in your motherboard and plug it in. Make sure you just check whether your motherboard manufacturer actually supports 5000 series on their new BIOS updates or whatsoever. But highly likely your motherboard may support the 5000 series. But like I said earlier, on the Intel side, the only motherboard from prior generations that can support the 11th gen is the Z490 motherboards and also the B460 motherboards. And if you have those motherboards, obviously you have a 10th gen CPU. If you think it is worth an upgrade, go ahead. But if you were to ask me personally, I would say that it is not worth an upgrade from 10th gen to 11th gen, because the next upgrade that is coming from Intel will most likely also change their chipset, and you would probably not be able to use the 11th gen CPUs on them anyway. And highly likely you will need to buy a new motherboard for the upcoming processors as well, because 12th gen apparently is running on another different kind of pin layout, which means it's another chipset altogether. What I meant to say is the socket is going to be different, not the chipset, but the chipset obviously is going to be different as well. Highly likely it is not going to be the LGA 1200 that the 10th gen and 11th gen are running on right now. So it is actually pretty tough to recommend the 11th gen CPUs to anyone right now who is looking to upgrade. But if you are in the market for a new computer itself, so you are going to buy the motherboard and the CPU from scratch. If you are looking for an 8-core CPU, if you have the patience to wait it out, get the 5800X. But if you're in the market for like a 6-core 12-thread CPU just for like gaming and also like light workloads, the i5 is definitely a no-brainer. Simply because the 11600K is actually slightly cheaper than the 5600X if you don't count like inflation and stuff like that, like all the scalpers and stuff. The 5600X is actually $30 more expensive than the i5 11600K. So if depending on where you stay, if you find the 11600K and the 5600X in stock, go for the cheapest one. And like I said earlier, if you're in the market for an 8-core CPU, the 5800X is a no-brainer. Let's talk about retail pricing, not the inflated scalper pricing. But if you have a retail version of the 5800X, just get that because it's way cheaper than the 11900K. But one thing that really annoys me about the Intel motherboards is that the Intel motherboards look so good. This is the Intel Z590 Hero, and if you want to compare this to the X570 Hero, this looks way better in design. And Intel designs for all their motherboards and stuff like that has always been really beautiful. So yeah, hopefully this has given you enough information on whether 11th gen is a good buy, and if you are looking to get like a new CPU and a new motherboard, hopefully this video has helped you decide on that. For our next episode of YTech, we're actually going to talk about whether you need a gaming chair. So you see all these gaming chairs right at the back here. I've actually tested all of them. And also you see the ErgoTune over here. This is an ergonomic chair. I will actually check with an expert whether you need a gaming chair or not, and what kind of posture you would need to like sit in front of your computer, which chair would like support all your back being straight and stuff like that. Till then, please stay safe and I will see you in the next video. Yeah.